Werner's been around for a long time. When I was a first-timer at the International Union, or it may have been my second time, it was either in 1982 or 1984 when I met Anthony. It was... Did you go to the conference in Utrecht, or in Holland? Cambridge was your first one? Holland. So we met at Holland then. And so we've known each other for a bit. And Anthony was, a year later, I think it was 1983, came out with his first Shepheard-Walwyn book called Power in the Land, written by Fred Harrison. And that was the beginning of I think a publishing company that went on to, and is still publishing, I think, some of the most important Georgist work that we've got. And Robert Schalkenbeck Foundation does obtain copies from Shepheard-Walwyn and puts them on our list. And most of the good stuff, most of the new stuff on our list are Shepheard-Walwyn titles. And so I invite you to take advantage of our deep discounts at this conference and make yourself familiar with some of the output of Shepheard-Walwyn. And a lot of it are books by Fred Harrison. There are many other books also that Shepheard-Walwyn publishes. So they're here almost for the taking. So Anthony, I believe, is going to speak to us. I know he's also connected with the School of Economic Science, which is an organization founded to teach Georgist economics about in the 1940s, I think. 37. And also teaches the perennial philosophy, and something many Georgists, even before the SES was around, were also familiar with. I think many Georgists have a philosophic tendency, so it's a good fit. And I know he publishes books for them as well, plus other commercial books. If he may tell you about it, I'm not sure if it's the theme of his talk, but he did say one thing to me once, which is, my commercial books subsidize my Georgist books. And this is something that, you know, and RSF is well aware of it. You know, in a sense, we don't make a profit selling books, but the books are the vehicles for the ideas. So in getting out the ideas that we're all championing, books is one of many vehicles. There are a lot of newer ones, and they all dovetail. I think they actually reinforce each other. If you see a book online, some people go out and buy it in paper. So I think publishing actually has a future. It's not coming to an end for this movement. Anyway, without further ado, from all the way from London, England, Mr. Anthony Werner.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. It's the first time I've attended Council of Georgist Organisations meeting, but I've been to some of the IU meetings. And one of the things that really strikes me is how different each country, we've just seen South Korea, and now, for me, the new experience coming from Britain, to see how you face, ultimately, a fundamental truth. you may have noticed in the thing that I was asked to give a name to the talk, which is a principled approach to economics. And that idea came to me from a quotation from Edmund Burke, which goes along the lines that the principles which guide us in public and private, as they are not of our devising, but moulded into the nature and essence of things, will endure with the sun and the moon. Now, economics generally today is not thought of as a science or as having certain undeniable truths. And some of you may have come across, I think it's Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, and I'm not saying this as a way of putting Americans down, but but the point he made was that he said that as a professor at Harvard, he could be certain that most of his students would deny that there was any such a thing as truth. And that's not an uncommon view today, that one person's opinion is as good as another. And I think one of the things I've learned from studying the work of Henry George and economics in the broadest sense is that there are certain fundamental principles that do not change. And I think that that gives the Georgist movement a foundation which is very important. One of the things that arising out of my publishing, well, first of all, Mark mentioned Fred Harrison. So I published his first book in 1983, but then he later came back with some other ones and made the point that what was needed was new literature to explain Henry George to a contemporary world, and conditions have changed since then. But then later, about another 20 years later, I was approached by a professional economist who'd been teaching economics for 20 years and eventually came to the conclusion that what he'd been teaching his young students was wrong, lacked something. So he spoke to his professor about it, and the professor said, sorry, we've got to teach it. He was a man of integrity, so he resigned. And he then went to Oxford to take a theology degree to look at sort of ethical side of things. He originally had come from Iran, so I've never questioned him too much because you can't admit to being a Christian really if you're a Muslim. But he's obviously very much into the Sufi thing, so he's got this profound moral, spiritual view of how man should live. And arising out of him, he's ordered one of our books, The Natural Economy, and then went on. But what I learned from him and was this important thing that modern economics, the neoclassical economics, the way it is taught, and I hope Nick Tiedemann will confirm this, is that the important thing is profit maximization, cost minimization. The whole thing is totally devoid of any ethical content. And I think that you can see this whole idea that economists have now, rather like at the time of the Renaissance, the economists are the high priests in the same way that the Catholic Church was in Western Europe, that they controlled what was knowledge and what was not knowledge, and that it's very difficult. And I've been very encouraged here to find a number of professors and a number of academics breaking down this mold. And some of you may have come across a student movement, which one of the first places was in Manchester University, where some of the students in around about 2008, maybe 2009, formed a post-crash economics society to try to work out for themselves and to persuade their professors to change what they were being taught, because the way the neoclassical, this is what they said, what the neoclassical economics that they were being taught was being taught as Holy Writ, and that was how it was, and there was no alternative. And so that has morphed into a larger organisation called Rethinking Economics. I don't know if any of you have come across this, and I don't know how lively it is, but for 1 year I was in touch with them, and the School of Economic Science provided some funding when they had a second conference at Greenwich University. So, but what I've noticed there was that they got stuck in the idea that as an alternative to neoclassical economics, you've got to have pluralism. Well, pluralism implies that you could, well, on the one hand and on the other. I don't know if, I'm told there was an American president who said he wished he could find a one-armed economist because he was fed up with the one hand and on the other. So I think it comes back to this point that, you know, is there something that you can absolutely rely on as fundamentally true and invariable, as Burke put it, that is moulded into the nature and essence of time, in the nature and essence of things, and will endure with the sun and the moon? Well, I think we all know that one of the basic laws of economics is the law of rent, and that operates whether you believe in it or you don't. And we've touched on that, you know, we've touched on that on a number of occasions today. You know, that the whole point is that, you know, the citizen's income is a nice idea, to get something in a sense for nothing. But if you don't have the collection of rent, that's only going to enrich the existing landowners. So I think, you know, we're privileged to have discovered and appreciate this law of rent, and that to make that more widely known, you know, knowledge of that more widely spread is in a way what I've tried to do in the publishing. So, thank you for your attention.
We'll bring Anthony back here to respond to any questions and comments.
Yes.
Yeah, I was in New York City, and we were several Georgists from Henry George School were sitting in the audience with the Rethinking Economics people, and we bring up, well, how about the Henry George theorem? And they were really just didn't want anything to do with us.
They were really what?
They didn't want anything to do with us.
No.
It wasn't worthy.
No.
And we were just kind of scratching our heads saying, you know, we're trying to start over, trying to envision something different.
Yes.
And here they were just shoving it off the table.
Yes, no, that's what I noticed too. It's very disappointing, the Greenwich. I mean, they provided platforms for a number of speakers, 2 or 3, but hardly any. There were always several things going on at the same time. Hardly anybody turned up. So it was very disappointing.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would draw from that is that maybe it's an operation by people who are supporting neoclassical economics just to show something different, to get everybody, oh, looking over there. Well, you know, anybody who's serious would make it.
Yes, I think it's interesting. This conference is bridging left and right, isn't it? I mean, in a way, the fallback position from attacking neoclassical is to go to the left. And it was interesting that Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, was looking for a third way, and he unfortunately chose a professor at London School of Economics who wrote a book on the third way, Anthony Giddens. But again, it was a mishmash, you know, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So that's really the Burke's point. There are some principles. And if you may remember, for those of you, you know, Jesus made the interesting point that the house which is built on rock survives the storm. The one built on sand doesn't. And I think that that's another way of looking at principle. There is something fundamental, firm, true, that you can rely on. But not everybody wants to know the truth.
Yes.
Polly has a question.
Yeah, can you give us a little bit of the history of Shepheard-Walwyn and who were Shepheard and Walwyn?
Well, Christopher Shepheard-Walwyn, it's a double-barreled name, was a young man involved with the School of Economic Science. His mother was one of the early members of it, and he had founded a publishing company. He worked for one of the bigger ones, and then he found something to start. And like most small companies, one lacks capital. My publishing background, I began at the Oxford University Press. And I worked for a time at Pergamon Press, and then went back to Oxford University Press. And somebody in the school knew that he was looking for capital. I happened to have inherited some money, and some of us at the Oxford University Press were so bored, we were all trying to set up a company on our own, but we never could come up with a particular idea that was worth launching. So by good fortune, I had something he needed, and he provided me with access to a company, and so I joined it, and about 5 years later, it nearly collapsed. I was the only person that was worth saving. I was a bachelor, he had a family of 4 kids, and he couldn't survive running a small company. I've managed to somehow stay alive, God only knows how, but it's been an interesting ride. And one of the things I've learned and realized is that my authors are my tutors. They've taught me a great deal, because when you read somebody else's work, and part of the thing is to try to improve it, and one of my favorite words of publishing is clarity, and is how to convey the thought. When we speak, there's a different language. When you write, it's another language. I mean, I've just been involved at the moment with the memoirs of Princess Olga Romanov, which sounds as though it could be quite exciting. But all she did was chat into a microphone, and I've had to employ one of my authors to make it into a written word. So it's a very important difference, the spoken and the written word. You know, when one speaks, one makes a gesture, or tone of voice, or whatever it is, conveys things that the written word doesn't. You've got to spell it out in the written word. Does that answer your question, Polly?
It's the beginning, but how long ago was this?
How long ago? Right, he founded the company in he actually bought a company off the shelf, you know, the actual shell, and changed its name. In 71, he published his first books in 1972. Surprisingly, about 4 years ago, I was approached by one of the big companies, could they republish it? And I get a nice check every 6 months from them for his very first book. So he chose a very good subject for his first book. So it's one of the interesting things about publishing. It's a long-term business, but it's staying alive in the long term.
And there's a Yugoslav saying that says that tell the truth and run. Maybe that's especially true in Yugoslavia, but is there a safe place where you can tell the truth and hang around, or is that what we all have to do?
Well, one of the things I remember seeing in a poem on a mantel shelf, and one of the interesting things it said was, first seek the level of him to whom you're speaking. So as Jesus put it, don't cast your pearls before swine, because they will turn and rend you. So it's a question of, you know, there's an appropriate time to say things, and an appropriate audience.
Anthony, this is a question about after a book has been published about marketing. What's your experience? Because it tends, you get a book published, and maybe that's the easy part. The harder part is getting it into people's hands to read it. Do you have any thoughts what we should be here to better
Sorry, I can't see where the question's coming from. Oh, there.
Yeah, right. Could you give us some insight into what we should be doing in North America to promote books like yours, your publishing house? And do you have any advice, because it is all about getting the books into the hands of the people that would probably read them?
Well, it's difficult to get to find readers for these books. I mean, one of the things that's encouraged me was I import the Shepheard-Walwyn Progress in Poverty, and clearly underlying there is a growing concern. I mean, we sell, I don't know, 4 or 5 of the Drake one, but what I've noticed recently is the full edition, so that the audience which we're trying to address is somewhere out there, but it's finding them. And I think one of the interesting things, of course, is the internet, and how people from, I get inquiries from Australia, well, United States, places, which surprises me how they hear it, but somewhere just to have it available to attract people when they're ready. But as to what you can do here, I mean, I think the problem possibly you have in this country is, well, our previous speaker about the citizens' income, he's managed to find a publisher, which I notice is Palgrave Macmillan, which was a British company, though I think it's now owned by an American, St. Martin's Press. He managed to find a publisher, and it might well be, he can perhaps comment better than I can, on finding a publisher who sees a growing market in this area and is prepared to build it up, because it takes time. I mean, when I published Fred Harrison's Power on the Land, actually that was quite an amusing incident, because it took us 6 months to find that title, and it reached the stage where each time we phoned each other, we'd say, "You've got a new title." And he was at that time a very well-paid investigative journalist, and he had a Rolls Royce, literally second-hand. And so he invited me to lunch at the newspaper office. We were sitting and finishing, and he said, "What time do you have to be back?" And I said, "To the office." I said, "Well, about 3 o'clock. He looked at his watch and went off to get a cigar, because that's the lifestyle he enjoyed in those days. And while he was away, I remember just falling silent, and the title dropped into my mind. It was almost as if it was hovering about. And when I said it to him, he said, "Come, let's go." He didn't even sit down. But I didn't realise at the time, if you ever look at Power on the Land, you'll see there's an interesting quote from Winston Churchill, which illustrates the power in the land. So it was a strangely apposite title. And when we realise and appreciate the power in the land, it's an enormous power. I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry, your question.
From my understanding, the publisher, the distribution house here distributes your book. But I'm wondered about, it is all about marketing. Do you have any thoughts on how the marketing here can be improved so that you increase the possibility that people will read it?
Oh, I understand, yes. Well, yes, our books are distributed out of Chicago by the Independent Publishers Group, which, as its name suggests, includes a number of independent publishers like Shepheard-Walwyn. I found them very good. I mean, I don't think we would ever have been taken on board because we were too small. But we were distributed by a small distributor who was hungry and needed more people. So they work hard at it, and I think Phil Anderson's book, Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, they're selling large numbers of that. I've just had to do about my 5th reprint on that book. So, but a distributor doesn't have promotion in the sort of newspapers and that kind of thing. So I've been surprised that they have carry, I mean, for example, Corruption of Economics, they chug along with that. We have a book called Christianity and Social Order, which they reprint regularly. But they're not huge quantities. I mean, you can obtain the books through Schalkenbach, but if you order them through IPG, they'll probably cost you a bit more. But it means from their point of view, they see there is a bigger market, and that can help.
One of the things that we've dealt with in engaging with the marketing question and in funding projects is what is the actual ratio between production costs and then promotional costs, and what would be a desirable ratio? In other words, right now, for example, is most of the cost of any particular book the actual production, and if you had your desired budget, how much would you put into then promoting and marketing as a percentage, let's say?
Yes, I mean, I'm just publishing a book, or I've literally just published a book on the outbreak of the First World War, which has completely, has revealed a whole area that's been neglected by scholarship. Now that's, luckily we managed through the agent of the author to get a very distinguished historian to give a endorsement, which carries weight. Because one of the problems from a smaller publisher's point of view is bookshops won't stock it unless they're asked for it, because there are something like 200,000-300,000 books published a year. With self-publishing, it's probably even more now. So it's very, very difficult to get bookshops to stock it in advance, so that somebody can walk into a bookshop and say, well, I've not seen that. That's where most of the books that Shepheard-Walwyn sells now, I'm talking in the UK, are through online bookshops. We don't sell direct to Amazon because they demand too big a discount, so we sell to wholesalers who then supply Amazon. But Amazon have such a stranglehold over distribution. But I mean, in actual promotion, by and large, there's a small company hasn't got a budget for that. There's not much, you've got to sell a lot. The basic costing, you need, say your unit cost of a book were £5. Ideally, you ought to publish it at £30, which sounds a huge amount, but what you've got to realise that out of that £30, you've got to give 40% to the bookshop or the wholesaler. So that's immediately reduced it. And then you've got to pay the printer, which is, well, there's £5 out of that. And then you've got to pay for the warehouse, the salesman. And so what's left for the publisher is a relatively small amount out of every copy. What, of course, does happen, if you have a reprint, in publishing a book, there's an origination cost, typesetting, jacket design, that kind of thing, and there's a print cost. So if you're lucky enough to go to a reprint, then you've cut out perhaps a third of your original £5 unit cost. So from then onwards, you might pay, instead of making £4 or £5, you might make £7 or £8. So that's why reprints are very much more profitable in the long runs. And one of the difficulties for an author is to get a big publisher, because a big publisher is not going to take a book on unless he can sell at least 10,000, and that's probably an outdated figure. They probably wouldn't touch it unless, or is Wiedequist, isn't it? Was saying his book was selling at $100, or the Henry George, annotated Henry George. So those small runs sold at a price which make them prohibitive. No one's going to buy them. So it's a vicious circle.
my question originated with Dan's, and now I'm going to ask my question. It's sort of related. And a preface is one of your, from a Georgist point of view, most important projects was the Georgist Paradigm Trilogy, with Corruption of Economics being the most popular and most famous and infamous of the titles. I hope the other two can be brought back into print. There's another project that you're involved with, again connected to Fred Harrison and Mason Gaffney, is the German translation and publication of Rent Unmasked, which is by the publisher Metropolis in Germany. And they're also now coming out with the German translation of Progress and Poverty in German again at last. And if Nick is here, he may find it interesting. We gave permission for them to use Florence Plassman's. Florence Plassman put the German black letter edition into modern type. And RSF had it, but we didn't have a publisher, and Dr. Dirk Lohr comes along. And so that is happening. There's a flyer floating around about that. But Anthony, can you say a little bit about how you got Rent Unmasked translated into German, how that came about?
Well, I'm just trying to remember exactly how it happened. I mean, Dirk Lohr was one of the contributors to Rent Unmasked, and I think the point was that he said to Fred that he would volunteer to do the translation. So from the German publisher's point of view, he didn't have the cost of translating, which is quite high, and therefore would obviously push up the unit costs of the book. So the fact that it was translated by Dirk, and I think Dirk found a publisher as well. I don't know how he had a connection there, but so I think that was just a fortuitous circumstance that we had somebody actually in Germany. Fred's Boom Bust was translated into German by Wiley's, and that happened because the publisher, or I think he was the editorial director, based in Germany, happened to visit Wiley's in New York, and in the bookshop, now this is the problem, isn't it? In the bookshop, somewhere, Scribner's or somewhere, in New York, he picked up a copy of The Power and the Land, Boom Bust, and he was impressed by it. So he had that translated, but they didn't do very well with it, so after a year they junked it. But that's the thing, a big company is not interested in the long term. And I say they're not interested in the sense that it's got to return a profit in a short time, and if it doesn't, forget it. They cut their losses.
Anthony, can you tell us what happens to books after they get dropped, and what the possibilities might be for Schockenbach or other entities to acquire rights to books published a long time ago?
Yes. I think as I mentioned, the first book that Christopher Shepheard-Walwyn ever published, I mean, in most authors' contracts, the author authorizes the publisher to publish it for the life of the copyright. Now, some authors will set a time limit on it, but that's not common, and certainly none of the authors I've published, shall we say, have the bargaining power to do that, or would even think about it. Most of them are very pleased to be published in the first place. What small publishers will tend to take on new authors. If the smaller publisher is successful with that book, they might then migrate to a bigger publisher, often to the chagrin of the smaller publisher, that they built the author up, so that then the big publishers are interested in them. But essentially, normally, and that was was certainly the case in Christopher Shepheard-Walwyn's first book. The rights remain with us for as long as, well, she's died, and so her daughter owns the copyright. I suppose she could technically say to us, unless you publish a new edition, I want the rights back. But at the moment, luckily, it's been Little Brown are selling an edition, a paperback edition of it. But that's the way copyright works, but fundamentally. Shall we all call it a break there then? Thank you.